So this is fucking insane. I just read Osama bin Laden's letter to America, which I will be going through right here, but it's actually so mind-fucking to me that terrorism has been sold as this idea to the American people, and honestly just so many Western inhabitants within certain nations, that this group of people, this random group of people, just suddenly wakes up one day and just fucking hates you, just wants you dead, wants you gone, and this is all because they believe that they're better than us. Like, that is the root of terrorism. It doesn't make sense. They just hate your fucking nation. But reading this letter, it becomes apparent to me that the actions of 9/11 and those acts committed against the USA and its people were all just the buildup of our government failing other nations. I really urge everybody to Google and read it, because I thought that I had quite a lot of media literacy, but this takes it to a whole nother fucking level where I was just like, holy shit, like propaganda is genuinely so deeply embedded into our fucking DNA.
I need everyone to stop what they're doing right now and go read. It's literally 2 pages. Go read A Letter to America. And please come back here and just let me know what you think, because I feel like I'm going through like an existential crisis right now, and a lot of people are. So I just need someone else to be feeling this too.
I just tell the truth, and telling the truth is crazy in a world full of lies.
That's a form of overcorrecting. We're overcorrecting at this point. America can still be the imperialist, capitalist country that it is, and Osama bin Laden can still be a dictator that was terrible to his people and committed war crimes. Like, both of those things can be true. We don't have to swing the pendulum. I think that's what's wrong with this. We swing the pendulum so far, we're like either super pro patriotic America, or we're like, yes, Osama bin Laden was right. Like, that is overcorrecting to a point where it's like, I'm having to get on here and tell y'all that Osama bin Laden was still a bad person. But we're all still educating ourselves and learning. But like, let's be critical thinkers. Let's just think critically.
I've been seeing a bunch of people reading bin Laden's letter to America for the first time, and they're feeling like shocked and grossed out that it's as reasonable as it is in comparison to what they were expecting. And I'm seeing a bunch of people in their comments being like, did you forget the violence? Did you skip over all the religious extremism? Did you miss that part? Did you forget what he did? And to those people, to anyone who would have that reaction, to seeing that reaction to bin Laden's letter to America, how do you respond to people who support the US military? When you see somebody supporting the US military, openly showing support for the US military, are you vastly more disgusted with them? You ask them if they just haven't noticed all the religious extremism? Do you ask them if they've forgotten about all of the violence? Are you proportionately disgusted? Because you should be vastly more disgusted. If not, why isn't your reaction proportionate?
Okay, I can quite quickly answer this one. The US military operates under state authority, and the state has a legitimate monopoly over the means of violence, which means that a terrorist organization, in comparison, does not, because it doesn't operate underneath state authority. The US military are not a terrorist organization. That is the distinction. Whether we like it or not, whether that fits into some kind of conspiratorial narrative, it is what it is. And in order to prevent any kind of misuse of that legitimate monopoly over the means of violence, the US military, like the US state, are under very clear and very strict, although very complicated, laws and regulations, which keep it in constant check and balance. Now, of all things that I thought would get me out and through this fortnight of very terrible depression, because I am one of those people who plays Al Jazeera News live 24 hours a day, and therefore my entire sense of this world has just been shattered. I never thought that it would be TikTokers frothing at the mouth over Osama bin Laden that would get me through this, but they have, and I only have them to thank for that fact of the matter, and that is the only thing that I can thank them for. But I've had a bit of time to think about this, and this is something that I think needs to be approached in a very delicate manner. This is something which has clearly created, at least on TikTok, a divide between people who are claiming that these TikTokers are stupid, that they are privileged Westerners who haven't seen war or haven't seen real, true violence, that they hate US foreign policy and the US to such an extent that they will support anything or anyone who is as anti-America and anti-American foreign policy as they are. And then on the other hand, I see people arguing that Osama bin Laden said some pretty base things, or Osama bin Laden actually had justifiable reason for his explanations as to why he committed the most heinous and atrocious human acts recorded in modern history. I think both sides are very, for understandable and personal reasons, no doubt, caught up in their own narrative, in their own sort of creation of a dichotomy between who is right and who is wrong, and vice versa. And as I said, this is perfectly understandable. But I do think that sometimes we really miss the middle ground in a lot of things. And I know this is contentious. This is terrible stuff that I'm suggesting. The possibility of nuance, the possibility that we may not always be right and that the other side may not always be wrong. So I'd like to take this opportunity to look at some of these now notorious TikToks and to provide some context and some explanation from my perspective as somebody who is just very interested in foreign policy and in especially the idea of international relations, the sort of theoretical basis and the historical information that informs it, especially in our modern age, since the formation of what we now know as the modern nation state, which actually is a very recent phenomena, a very fragile one, which has only truly been with us since 1945, after the Second World War. So take from this what you may. I know I'm a woman speaking about politics, and therefore I will not be taken terribly seriously. But do bear with me.
This morning I read Letter to America, which is Osama bin Laden's letter to America explaining why he attacked Americans. And I am ashamed to say that I not only have never read this letter, but I didn't even know this letter existed. It's wild, and everyone should read it. If you haven't read it yet, read it. However, be forewarned that this has left me very disillusioned, and I feel the same exact way I felt when I was deconstructing Christianity. I feel a little bit just confused, like I have entered into another timeline. What is this? And yeah, so go read it.
I find it fascinating that people are discovering Osama bin Laden's letter to America. And not just this letter to America that was on The Guardian and has since been taken down, but also his collected works and interviews that have been transcribed, in which he basically says the same key points and phrases, makes the same excuses and explanations for why he is doing what he is doing, why he and Al-Qaeda are against the West, and specifically the United States. And by the United States or America, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda then, as now, even the small factions that are still left, mean not just American soldiers, but specifically and even more importantly, American civilians. That is, American men, women, and of course, children. Now, I'll get back to this because this is a key emergence and a key conceptual lack of distinction between combatants and civilians that is itself a very new, or at least in terms of since modern history, new idea that really took hold after the end of the Cold War. And it especially took hold in what we now know and we now call fundamentalist organizations, specifically Islamic fundamentalist organizations. Now, in this sort of reaction video, or whatever this is, I am going to be focusing heavily on Islamic fundamentalism, not in the way of sort of looking at the history of Islamic fundamentalism or quoting scripture from the Quran, but instead crucially looking at its theoretical underpinnings, looking at how it has been interpreted and made sense of by especially experts in international relations and experts in counter-terrorism and in terrorist groups. A book that is actually really good on this was written by the former Vice Chancellor of Oxford University.
So to start with, what do we talk about, what do we mean when we use this term that's very broadly used, terrorism. Very simply, I think terrorism is the deliberate targeting of non-combatants for political purposes. So it is the means that a group use, not the ends that they seek, which should determine whether or not a group is a terrorist group. In the book, I actually go through a more elaborate definition listing 7 crucial characteristics that I'll be happy to get into. But the key is that it's the means used, not the ends that are being sought. And I would argue that unless and until we're willing to label a group whose goals we consider legitimate a terrorist group, if they deliberately target civilians to achieve those goals, then we're never actually going to make progress in countering terrorism.
And I would argue that when trying to understand these things, it is very important not to just look at the primary text, such as Osama's letter to Americans or letter to the American people, or to look at something like the autobiographical writings of political figures, of individuals who are writing about their story. Because inevitably, one of the downsides from, I think right now, our culture's emphasis on lived experience, our culture's emphasis on the personal, and therefore you cannot invalidate the personal experiences of somebody, is that we lose that very crucial thing, which is critique, which is analysis from outsiders looking in, seeing how you are incapable of seeing yourself from a different and I think very crucial perspective. So I would suggest that when reading some primary text, some political pamphlet or autobiography from a religious zealot or a political figure, a revolutionary or some kind of done hard by individual and poor soul trying to get the world on his or her side, that you don't just read what they have to say about how they see the injustices committed against them that they have to fight against. You look at bodies and people who are experts, people who don't have a vested interest, who are specialists in not just these individuals, but in the ideals, in the theocracies, in the worldviews that these individuals have underpinning all of their thought and all of their sense of being ill-treated by the world or by a specific group. And I will not kid you, this is difficult to find because bias and impartiality are not natural to us. They are not natural to anybody. But I would say that a good place to start is with think tanks that create and have the means to create and to gather very good and representative data. And by think tanks, I mean think tanks that are not in any way associated with any political divide. There are, of course, think tanks that are pro-left or pro-right or what have you. And, you know, that's something that you just have to find out on your own through looking at their work, through looking at who works within these think tanks, etc. But I do think that that is inevitably the very long-winded effort that has to go into discovering the complexities of the world and of this thing that we all think we all know, which is the truth. Nobody really knows the truth of anything, but we do try our best. And I do think that these TikTokers are not trying their best.
We're seeing footage from terrorist organizations releasing their hostages and the hostages saying that they were being treated kindly and actually questioning their own government.
They are just TikTokers. A lot of them, I'm sure, are very, very young, very impressionable, and so this makes sense. But some of them, just based on knowing who they are online as influencers, should know better, and they really should do a lot better. So let's get into it.
The way my jaw was dropped last night. Everybody go read Osama bin Laden's letter to America because it will literally have you speechless. I literally read it last night and I cannot stop thinking about it because it just was like the last piece of the puzzle that just clicked. I'm just gonna leave it off on the note that that's why Osama bin Laden was labeled as such a big terrorist. And that's why he was the most wanted, because clearly he knew things that the US didn't want other people to know.
Osama bin Laden wasn't wanted by the US because he knew things that the US didn't want other people to know. Osama bin Laden's life was brought to an end because of what he had done, because of what he represented as a symbolic figurehead, at least at the point of his death, to Al-Qaeda and to other terrorist organizations. He didn't leave this earth with secrets that are suddenly being unearthed. I don't know how they are suddenly being unearthed right now via a Guardian transcript of a letter that he wrote, or via TikTokers having a sort of existential crisis about US foreign policy and the realities of the formation and sustaining of the nation state. But I do think it is incredibly simplistic and naive.
No hate to you or any of the other commenters in this comment section. I just generally don't understand how so many people can completely miss the point of the video.
Hey, are you even paying attention to me right now?
Talented, brilliant, incredible, amazing, show-stopping, spectacular, never the same, totally unique, completely not ever been done before, unafraid to reference or not reference, put it in a blender, shit on it, vomit on it, eat it, give birth to it.
Me reading this letter has nothing to do with taking on the beliefs of Osama bin Laden or sympathizing with Osama bin Laden. Reading this letter opened my eyes to what actually went down for 9/11. It made me realize what our government has been helping to fund against the Palestinian people for decades upon decades. That is it. It has nothing to do with believing in anything that Osama bin Laden believes. Okay? He was not a good person. Okay? I don't agree with any of his beliefs. I do now, however, see that my classmates and my family members, who were all in Iraq after this happened and thought they were going over there to fight for freedom, were sent over there because our government is money hungry and full of greed. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with innocent civilians being bombed and killed for governments wanting money. That's it. That's the end of it.
Now, the point that this TikToker makes at the end about the US going in for money and greed, bombing innocent civilians for money and greed, this idea that America was going in to create conditions of freedom and that ultimately not being the case, is a very, very interesting point. And there is actually a lot of truth in this. But there is, of course, far more than meets the eye when it comes to this statement and these declarations, because this is nothing at all new or exceptional about the modern nation state and what they do and what they ultimately have to do and have found themselves persistently in a moral bind about. The actual official creation of what we now know to be and consider to be the modern nation state is naively often attributed to what is called the Westphalian system, which came into being after 1648. From 1648, the concept of the nation state no doubt came into the public imagination more readily, but its actual creation really only goes back to about 1945. The immediate post-World War II era saw the redefining of borders, of territories, and of people in Africa and the Middle East, as well as in Europe. And this defining and redefining of people and borders and territories is nothing new, and it is also something that continues to this very day, not just in the case of borders and people, but also in the way of identities. And nation state's foreign policy is so intimately tied to the existence of the nation state that I think sometimes, at least in my mind, they are virtually indistinguishable. Without foreign policy, there is no nation state, and without a nation state, there is no foreign policy. At least that's how I see it. I think that one thing that the liberal psyche has done, as is exhibited in these TikToks, is that it takes for granted how very new the nation state, including the United States, really is. And it also takes for granted what has been and will continue to be the continual brutality of the defining and redefining of nation states. And this redefining and defining of the nation state is something that is very intimately tied to this liberal idea of a right to self-determination, which at least since the end of the Cold War and the quote-unquote victory of the West means that more and more people are entitled to or perceive themselves as entitled to self-determination. We kid ourselves in thinking that such self-determination can ever be done entirely peacefully or without violence. And this is something which I think the victory of liberal ideals has made very difficult to fathom, to comprehend, or to come to terms with in the realm of realism or realpolitik. Just look at the recent ethnic cleansing of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. This ethnic cleansing and the dissolution of the Republic of Artsakh only happened last month. Look at the continued, if not perpetual, violence of the world's youngest, newest nation state, South Sudan. Basically, modern history is not one that is exempt from violence, brutality, and precarity. But what does make our modern history since the post-World War II era exempt and exceptional is the longevity of these nation states, of a lot, if not the majority of nation states. This really has not been seen before, beyond that of an empire, which, I mean, is not really about self-determination. Empires are about sort of the self-determination within the collective of the empire. So it is very, very exceptional and very, very different to see the longevity of these nation states and the respecting, quote unquote, respecting of self-determination of their idiosyncratic and different identities and systems of governance. But one of the things about World War II is that what clearly emerged was a very obvious global superpower in the form of the United States of America. And looking at ideals which permeated the American imagination from that point onwards, really, is that there was a naive belief that liberal ideals would conquer all, that it was possible for liberal institutionalism to reign supreme, that people in the world, desperate, different, diverse people, could coexist peacefully and respectfully, and importantly, that this coexistence would be one in which everybody else not just looked to the United States as an example, but respected that the United States was on top and was ultimately the best. And because this was the ideal, because liberal institutionalism seemingly, at least theoretically, served everybody involved, everybody got a piece of the cake, everybody was invited to the party, everybody enjoyed the party according to liberal institutionalists. It was therefore perfectly justifiable to impose on and to expect people to willingly comply to these ideals the world over. Now, this all sounds very beautiful, and liberalism is theoretically a very beautiful thing. But one of the flaws of liberalism generically, especially modern liberalism, is that it fails to reconcile itself readily and without contradiction to the realities of foreign policy, which it oftentimes perceives itself to be exempt from. What liberalism has done, not exceptionally on its own, but in collaboration inevitably with a variety of other factors and things, is that it has decimated any chance of homogeneity within nation states or between nation states. It ironically doesn't create homogeneity and really doesn't tend to see a need to create homogeneity under the label of a nation state, because it wrongly, I think, perceives itself and liberal people and bodies as beyond violence. Liberalism sees itself as beyond the violence of the negotiation and creation of the nation state, which is seemingly something that happened years ago, centuries ago even. We have gone and progressed beyond that, far beyond that. Individualism also naively believes that individuality and that reason has triumphed over, or at least will eventually triumph over, tribalism and civil disputes and warfare. It believes that reason will triumph over the likes of instinct, of emotions and greed. And perhaps most importantly, and I would also argue most naively, liberalism has perpetually believed itself capable of triumphing over religious politics. When reading books written by individuals who really fit into this idea or caricaturing of liberalism that I have just done, which isn't just liberals, but also neoliberals and what we would label neoconservatives, it is not only noticeable when observing and reading their books or them talking, their speeches and writings, that they exhibit a naivety and also a bit of a hypocrisy in that naivety, as well as just this general smugness. And this smugness was especially jarring in the 1990s and early 2000s with the what is now known as a very infamous quotation or infamous declaration from neocon/liberal thinker Francis Fukuyama of the end of history. This idea that basically liberalism has triumphed and that history as we knew it before then, which was a history that was brutish, that was short, that was about being conquered and conquering, a history that was about the formation and destruction of nation states, that was all in the past. And we were now at a point where we were just beyond any of that. We had progressed greatly and successfully into a liberal future, not just as nation states, not just as the United States as a beacon of liberalism, but as an international community under the very kind and loving hand of liberal institutionalism. Trying to go back to life as normal after reading Osama bin Laden's letter to America and realizing everything we learned about the Middle East, about 9/11 and terrorism was a lie. Now, if you listen to my whole spiel about the story of very modern liberalism since World War II onwards, then I think you will notice that I was telling you a bit of a story, that this is very much a story, a theoretical story about sort of theory and ideas that are very present today and will probably be present for the rest of this century, at least in the West. Now, the thing about stories is that they aren't necessarily lies, but they aren't necessarily the truth. And a lot of history and a lot of politics and a lot of international relations are largely stories about what he said to him, what this leader said to that leader. This leader said this, and this leader responded or didn't respond, and this is creating something. This foreign minister decided to go behind this president's back to this country, and that has created some friction. Reading and following the news is very much like following a very long, never-ending story, and you don't necessarily know who is telling the truth and who isn't. But I would say that in everything that we read, everything that we see, everything that we are told in history books by our countries, by our nation states, there is always some truth somewhere in it, and it takes a while for that truth to come out, and that truth is sometimes something that isn't truth for very long. It sometimes is true in the moment, or it's true for a particular period of history, and then we learn other things or we change our interpretation. And that is what I like to call sort of the hermeneutical nature of truth. I wouldn't say that everything that Americans or Westerners have learnt about the Middle East, about 9/11, and about terrorism is a lie per se. I would say that it is just so complex, so dense, and so incredibly difficult for any human to possibly understand or to comprehend the entirety of what goes on the international stage, that when we find out bits of information that we didn't know that doesn't fit wholly into our very simplified and simplistic storytelling and picture of what went down, we then immediately assume that that story must be a lie, when actually it probably isn't a lie. It's probably something of the truth with a bit of flourish here, with a bit of fabrication there. But I think that it is very important to not see information that goes against or contradicts your worldview or your preconceived notions about how easy something is to understand, with lies, with misinformation, with there being some kind of conspiracy to hide the truth from you. The CIA and intelligence agencies are really not that smart. They are blood and bones human beings like the rest of us. They have a job to do, and their job is crucial, and it is most of the time a very contradictory job that is very difficult to live up to. I would say that American and Western-led foreign policy was and has been very much of its time since the post-World War II era. This era was that of the Cold War, which was ultimately an era of ideology, and therefore our foreign policy was incredibly ideological. And by being ideological, I mean that it was very much about what the world could be, what we ought to be, what we ought to strive for, and therefore justifying very heinous and very contradictory acts and policy decisions in the here and now in pursuit of this ideal for the future, this better ideal than the present. Necessary sacrifices have to be made in the present so that we can realize a future that is completely void of compromise, of contradiction, of violence. Western-led foreign policy during the Cold War was very much a naive notion that if the world was just more capitalistic, if it was more liberal, and if it were more quote-unquote free, it would be the end of redefining borders. It would be the end of conquering or being conquered by peoples and empires. It would be the end of colonialism, of imperialism, as well as the end of any potential resistance or resistance movements. And for much of the Western world, that is not their foreign policy, but rather their internal policy and makeup, this ideal has very much been the case for the vast majority of people. Because like myself, these TikTokers have overwhelmingly grown up in a stable nation state that hasn't had its borders threatened or redefined. And the idea of this stability being a very new and very fragile thing is, I would say, regrettably lost on these TikTokers. Contrary to their critique of American liberalism in the form of American foreign policy and its liberal institutionalism, these TikTokers exhibit the same kind of naive smugness that a lot of American liberal policymakers in the international arena have exhibited since the end of World War II, just from the other end of the pendulum where they are anti-American foreign policy.
Then you have to recognize that the light, the whole point of what the light is to expose the truth, right? So as long as you try to turn away from whatever the truth is, then you are not actually walking in the light. You're just choosing to be ignorant. There's darkness that exists in the world. And if we actually want that, like the darkness to change and to go away, and if we actually want the light to win, we have to acknowledge and fight against and stand up against the darkness that exists, right? So we have to wake up. We cannot just sit here and ignore what's going on and protect our peace and pretend, I'm just gonna protect my peace. I'm just gonna log off. No, what are we actually talking about? There are people literally dying. And the reason why the US has been able to support this for so long is because, especially in this country, we've been conditioned to think that there's nothing that we can do. There is something that you can do. Wake up. If enough people wake up, and if enough people are angry, and if enough people are in the streets, and if enough people decide to stop carrying on business as usual, if enough people decide to stop spending money on some of these businesses that are supporting this, then shit will change. But you don't want to do it because it's uncomfortable, right? And I'm not trying to be harsh or rude or mean. I'm not trying to spread fear or hostility or anger or anything. I'm just trying to get us to wake the fuck up, because this love and light bullshit, this spiritual like whatever, it's not like, it's literally you just choosing to be ignorant, and I'm tired of it. Wake up, understand what's going on, go have a conversation, go get outside, right? Learn about what you can do. I'm not saying to fucking turn your whole life off and become a warrior soldier. I'm just saying to wake up and care about other people. Please, I am begging you, just give a fuck about something other than yourself, please. This is the time, like there's an eclipse happening. I told you guys there's a shift happening in this matrix. People are waking up, but there's also it's happening, right? But what's gonna have to happen is we're gonna have to start getting a little bit uncomfortable. I am taken care of, and I'm gonna be okay, and I'm living. These bills wouldn't be existing if I wasn't living in abundance. Like, honestly, I could be avoiding a lot of these kinds of bills if I just like sat my ass down somewhere, found an apartment, you know, bought a car instead of renting a car on Turo. Like, I could avoid these things, but I've consciously chosen this life of abundance, especially like in this season of my life. And so this is what comes with it, and I think I'm just having to accept that. We're gonna have to start taking action and actually caring about things other than ourselves. This shift that I'm talking about that's happening is not just, oh, my life's gonna get better and I'm gonna start making more money and I'm gonna start feeling good, I'm gonna start going to the gym more. No, it's an actual shift that's happening. Like, the world is changing, right? Like, we are witnessing it happen in real time, and I need you to stop making it just about you and make it about shit that's like what's right and what's wrong. That's what this is about more than anything.
Y'all defending Osama bin Laden now? It's not that I'm defending him. I'm not defending him because like everything is fucked up. Like, all of this shit is fucked up. But I'm not about to sit here and act like he's just the worst person in the world when America has literally been terrorizing people since the beginning of history.
I agree wholeheartedly with this young woman. Yes, foreign policy is fucked up, and it will always be fucked up. Foreign policy is not and will never be liberal, in my humble opinion. And I think that the West, more so I would say the West policy leaders as opposed to the Western populace, have come to realize more readily and with a lot more pragmatism that in preserving liberalism and the stable liberal nation state at home, a liberal policy agendas on the international stage and in other countries has proved itself to be a necessary evil. Liberal leaders aren't immune to human instinct, they aren't immune to a liberalism, and they most definitely are not immune to greed.
America is literally built on terrorizing people. When what's his name? Fucking whatever the guy's name is that discovered America and found the land, he lied. It's been a lie. Everything's a lie.
I think this idea of America terrorizing people since the beginning of history, or this idea of America as the bad guy, really simplifies, overly simplifies the realities of foreign policy and of international relations, not just for America, but for every single country in the world, every single nation state in the world, attempting to preserve itself when history has shown that the odds are entirely stacked against them. Now, believe me, I'm no fan of not just American foreign policy, but any foreign policy. As you know, I am very individualistic and all about me, 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 me. But the recognition that I am living a life of individualism and me, because of the stability created by these means of preserving the modern liberal Western nation state is not lost on me. And this is very hard to come to terms with. This is very hard to reconcile oneself to. And often people who exhibit this realization are not truly seen as liberals. They are seen as betrayers of liberal ideals ideals and of liberalism. They're seen as more so political realists, shall we say. And as I said, I do think that a lot of liberal policymakers after the Second World War, and especially during the Cold War, and up until I would say 9/11, as well as these TikTokers and the here and now, really delude themselves in believing that liberalism, or that the ideals that we all embody in the West, are somehow exempt from the harsh realities of global politics. And so now let's move on to another group of ideals and people who believe themselves to be exempt from the harsh realities of the world and of global politics. Like, for instance, neoconservatives, they believe themselves to be acting from a place not of emotion, instinct, and greed, but from a place of religious enlightenment and awakening. And even though these individuals like to claim that their religious zealotry and awakening emerged as a response to American and Western-led foreign policy, something which all of these TikTokers and all of the TikToks that I have seen have taken as just being true, it is a lot more complex and long-winded than that.
I would argue that if you take a longer and a broader perspective, many of the widely accepted verities about terrorism today are in fact misplaced. Terrorism, for example, is not new. And indeed, the recent emergence of terrorist groups that have a mixture of religious and political motives are not new either. Such groups have been documented at least as far back as the Sicarii in the 1st century after Christ. Nor is terrorism the sole or even the primary preserve of Islam. Historically, there have been Christian terrorists, Jewish terrorists, Hindu terrorists, Muslim terrorists, atheist terrorists, and most often completely secular terrorists.
I would argue that rather than it being that this religious fervor and religious extremism emerged in response to American foreign policy during the Cold War, or for instance in the case of the Taliban or the Mujahideen in the case of Soviet or USSR foreign policy in the Middle East, I think it is just as, if not a bit more viable, to claim that the Cold War era really brought to the forefront the importance of identity. That is, the importance of identity insofar as the power it is capable of instilling not just on an individual, but on an entire nation state, on an entire superpower, on an entire potential world order. America, as a global superpower with more power than any empire preceding it, with more influence across the globe, with an ideal or ideals that informed its foreign policy that were ultimately projected to take over the entire world, whether it be from foreign interventions, whether it be from supporting particular governments with US interests, or whether it be from the Security Council of the United Nations. This was truly unparalleled and really represented the power, a real power of identity. So I think in our world now of nation states, of high stakes ideological politics, and specifically of identity politics, we really need to consider all of these things in relation to Islamic fundamentalism. Actually, not just Islamic fundamentalism, but in the case of this video, Islamic fundamentalism, but generally in the way of modern fundamentalism and extremism. Now, in thinking about this today, I couldn't help but notice some interesting parallels between the red pill and Islamic fundamentalists. Please note, I am not comparing them at all to one another. They are not comparable. The red pill is not a terrorist organization. It is not, at least at this point in time, in my opinion, fundamentalist in any way. I do not think that it has any power or influence in the way of Islamic fundamentalist organizations or theocracies. So please don't freak out. There's really nothing to fear, in my opinion, at least not now. But I do notice some parallels in a crucial way. These men, whether it be red pill men or Islamic fundamentalists or Islamic theocratic leaders, are men who fixate incessantly on a loss of identity and on a perceived loss of masculinity, or what they understand to be masculinity. And they ultimately all blame this on modernity, specifically on the liberation and education of women. Whilst modernity for the red pill is reduced to this idea of modern woman, modernity for the Islamic fundamentalist is reduced to the concept of the West, especially this idea of Western ideals such as the education of young girls and women, upsetting some kind of status quo. And I would say that this is the first reason why I think, nay, why I know these TikTokers do not understand Osama bin Laden or Islamic fundamentalism at all. Now, I will give these TikTokers one benefit of the doubt, and I will give them brownie points for one thing, just like I have and will probably continue to give the benefit of the doubt to red pillars on this one point. And that is that Islamic fundamentalists, like the red pill, do put forward some important critiques as well as some interesting insights into modernity and its downsides. And I would say that they do this especially when it comes to recognizing a modern identity crisis in the way of people finding spirituality and meaning in the modern world. But just like the red pill, Islamic fundamentalists' remedies and solutions to this are all based not in this world. They are based in a fantasy of the world, in a fantasy of woman, and most importantly, especially in the context of Islamic fundamentalism, they are based in a profound fantasy of men. Both the red pill and Islamic fundamentalists contradict themselves incessantly, but at the same time, they are always right.
Terrorists, no matter what their ultimate political objectives, invariably are action-oriented people operating in an action-oriented in-group. It's through action that they communicate with the world. And they don't have armies, they don't have territories, they have action. It's action that demonstrates their existence and proves their strength. So in taking action, they want above all to elicit a reaction, preferably an overreaction. Now, terrorists, I think, often have wildly optimistic expectations of the reactions their action will elicit, whether it's American and Israeli withdrawal from the Middle East, or British withdrawal from Northern Ireland, or the collapse of capitalism, or whatever. It actually appears as though they rarely have a very coherent idea of what kind of reaction they will get. I mean, it's striking to me that we don't actually know, 5 years after the fact, what bin Laden expected from his attacks on September 11th. Was he anticipating that we would wage war on Islam, which is quite possibly the case? Or was he anticipating, as he had often said, that we were a paper tiger, that we were so decadent and so corrupt we would never fight? He constantly invoked the examples of Mogadishu and Lebanon to support this notion. But it seems to me that he probably concluded that either reaction was possible and either reaction was fine with him. He won either way. So long as there was a reaction, the terrorist purpose is served.
In fact, at least when it comes to Islamic fundamentalists, far, far more so, the more contradictory they are, the more self-righteous and determined in their rightness they become. And because of this, there is inevitably a block when it comes to the one way that we all as modern citizens know how to overcome contradiction. And that is via reason, via facts, via the truth, via expertise, which are all things inherently tied to liberalism and what it ideally stands for. And because of this, there doesn't seem to be, and increasingly Western foreign policy has come to appreciate when it comes to Islamic fundamentalism, that there isn't actually a viable way to overcome it. There currently doesn't seem to be an obvious way to overcome their influence from the outside. Time and time again, when it comes to conversations about individuals who have been radicalized by extremist groups, by Islamic fundamentalist organizations, it is shown, and I repeat time and time again, it is shown that individuals have to actually come to this realization on their own. They have to come to this realization of these contradictions, that things aren't making sense before, for instance, the effects of de-radicalization can actually really work. Just like liberal and radical feminists arguing against or bringing statistics and facts to the red pill in no way persuade nor sway them, the West, specifically neoconservatism and neoliberal institutionalism, using war and coercion against Islamic fundamentalists, most definitely didn't put out their flame. And it has taken the West a very, very long time to realize this. Now, I think that there's something really, really amiss here when it comes to these TikToks and these TikTokers saying that they have realized something, that they have experienced some kind of awakening as precipitated or caused by Osama bin Laden's letters to America. The letter is basically Osama's explanation, his alleged explanation as to why 9/11 was necessary. It is a diatribe of anti-Semitism littered with homophobia, littered with a lot of anti-woman sentiment insofar as the tenets and buzzwords of Islamic fundamentalism are concerned. He very much repeats, almost word for word, in the letter what he was saying back in the 1990s when he was being interviewed by American journalists. During an in-person interview with ABC journalist John Miller in 1998, he said the following, quote, "So we tell the Americans as people, and we tell the mothers of soldiers and American mothers in general, that if they value their lives and the lives of their children, to find a nationalistic government that will look after their interests and not the interests of the Jews, the continuation of tyranny will bring the fight to America, as Ramzi Youssef and others did. This is my message to the American people, to look for a serious government that looks out for their interests and does not attack others, their lands or their honor. And my word to American journalists is not to ask why we did that, but ask what their government has done that forced us to defend ourselves. It is our duty to lead people to the light." In the same interview, he said, quote, "It does not make a difference if the government wants you to stay or leave. You will leave when the youth send you in wooden boxes and coffins, and you will carry in them the bodies of American troops and civilians. This is when you will leave. We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniforms and civilians. They are all targets in this fatwa." Now, I think it's interesting to read his letter and to read his interviews when you consider the following about who he is. That is that since the age of 17, this young millionaire and incredibly privileged, incredibly westernized boy then, but man at the time of his death, was an Islamic fundamentalist. And there are very important things to consider when you consider what a Islamic fundamentalist is. And in this, there is therefore a lot more than meets the eye when it comes to these quotations. Now, I think it's important that when I say this, I am saying this in reference to something that I have seen online a lot recently, not just in these TikToks, but just in general on the at least political online left, which is this idea that Hamas staged their attacks on Jewish civilians on October 7th of this year in self-defense, that this was inevitably going to happen out of desperation, a response to American foreign policy that supports and funds and finances Israel and Israeli intelligence. It is seen ultimately as defense as opposed to offense. A lot of the undertone to some of these TikToks, I would not say all of them, but to some of them, is that there are parallels, or at least in my mind, I can see parallels between the same kind of arguments being put forward in support of Palestinians via support of what Hamas did, and especially in Israel's response and retaliation for that, and Osama bin Laden's letter and explanation for the attacks in 9/11 and attacks on the West by Al-Qaeda in general. What these TikTokers are, I think, missing in their revelations or their awakenings or what have you, is that, as I said, Osama bin Laden is an Islamic fundamentalist, but Hamas are also Islamic fundamentalists. Osama bin Laden, just like Hamas, believe in something called existential warfare. The thing about existential warfare is that it is perennial. It is never ending. And we are, according to the vast majority of at least the most renowned Islamic fundamentalists, in a state of warfare right now. It is never ever ending. When it comes to existential warfare, a crucial aspect of it is that there is no distinction, and that there necessarily can never be a distinction between militants and civilians. That is, there can never be a distinction between people in uniform and between regular men and especially women and children. Now, what I get from these TikToks is this idea that the United States and US foreign policy fails to distinguish between militants and between innocent civilians, specifically innocent brown bodies in the Middle East and in parts of especially North Africa, and that because of the bombings, because of the violence committed against innocent civilians, of course this is absolutely true. There has inevitably been incessant bombing and killing of civilians that is completely backed by and committed by Western-led foreign policies and nations. But these TikTokers are under the misconception that these Islamic fundamentalists emerged in response to this, that this is merely a causal effect and a causal consequence of what the US has done in the name of greed, in the name of oil, and in the game of international relations. What they don't appreciate is that existential warfare means to the Islamic fundamentalist organization and individual that human beings, that civilians, are as much a part of the war as those who are fighting against the enemy or against the West. Therefore, civilians are used as human shields. Therefore, civilians are crucial to the very operation of war. Civilians need to feel and need to experience war, the destruction and the violence of war at every possible opportunity. Life can never be peaceful. Life can never be still. They can never not be in the line of fire. This idea that Osama bin Laden or that Hamas now care about women and children is completely false. No Islamic fundamentalist cares whatsoever about women and children, beyond that of their symbolism as victims, and therefore as symbols of why the existential war must persist and is therefore always justifiable. Basically, when it comes to the Islamic fundamentalist, the more bodies of civilians, the better.
I think quite a lot of hot air has been expended debating the point as to whether or not terrorism works. I think one cannot sensibly decide whether or not terrorism works without first establishing what it is that terrorists are trying to achieve. So I find it helpful to think in terms of primary and secondary motives. The primary motives differ across different types of groups. So nationalist groups will seek autonomy or secession. So groups like the Tamil Tigers, or groups in Kashmir, or the ETA in Spain, or the IRA in Northern Ireland, for example. Religious groups, on the other hand, seek the replacement of secular law with religious law. Or social revolutionary groups will seek to overthrow capitalism, and so on. So depending on the nature of the group, their political goals will differ. But I believe that the secondary or more immediate motives are shared across all different terrorist groups, and they're shared by both individual terrorists and the organizations to which they belong. And I would say that I think terrorists have been altogether more successful in achieving these secondary motives than they have been in achieving the fundamental political change that they're also trying to effect. So the key secondary motives are what I call, at the risk of oversimplification for the sake of alliteration, are what I call the 3 R's: revenge, renown, and reaction. I believe that's what terrorists want. By far the most common motive for their actions asserted by current terrorists, former terrorists, and terrorists of every ideological hue from every part of the world is the desire to exact revenge. Sometimes this is revenge for something they personally have suffered or their family has suffered, but often it's revenge for a wrong inflicted on a community with which they identify. Hence you have young middle-class men in Leeds identifying with Muslims in Iraq. Now, far from matching our description of them as selfishly pursuing their own ends, they generally identify with others and see themselves as sacrificing themselves for others.
Just like bin Laden and Al-Qaeda during 9/11, Hamas chose not to differentiate between soldiers and civilians on October 7th. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't something that happened in the moment. An assault that was planned minutes, even days before. And in choosing not to differentiate between Israeli soldiers and civilians, Hamas also chooses not to differentiate between its own combatants and Palestinian civilians. And this is all crucial to the fundamentalist agenda. And this isn't something that is just exclusive to Islamic fundamentalists. This is something characteristic of all modern fundamentalists and extremists. And I don't mean rogue extremists, I mean ones that are a part of an organization or collective. The more misery the Islamic fundamentalists or guerrilla fighters can enact on the very people they claim to represent, the more young and devastated people they can recruit. And because the jihad is never ending, because the state violence of the US or the state violence of Israel will always overshadow that of the relatively underfunded guerrilla fighters, will inevitably overshadow their funding and capabilities in the long term. The very misery that they garner all of their justification from in the first place must therefore never end.
So I think one of the key differences between in the language and the understanding between us and the terrorists we face is precisely on this issue of who is the victim and who is the aggressor. Now, I know that in this town and in New York, and particularly this week, when we've all been reliving the terrible tragedy of 5 years ago, it's very hard to grasp the notion that we could be anything other than the victim. But the reality is, terrorists see themselves as the victims of our aggression. We see ourselves as the victim of theirs, but they see themselves as playing David to our Goliath. Statements by Al-Qaeda, by all other terrorist groups, again, and whether this is true, whether they're for internal or external consumption, are suffused with the language of revenge. I think it's very difficult to overestimate the importance of the desire for vengeance.
I'm so sorry to break it to some of these TikTokers if they ever happen to watch this video, but Osama bin Laden's letter to the American people is not in any way reducible to this very pop academic dichotomy between the colonized and the colonizer. This overly simplified idea of some defenseless colonized against some omnipotent colonizer is doing far more harm than good in actually understanding global events and actually providing nuance and critical thinking, in appreciating the complexities of the nation state and of actors in the international arena. Bin Laden's letter was about simplifying his own taking of Islamic scripture to justify an otherworldly view of the world. And this otherworldly view, just like the pop academic dichotomy, reduces everything to this caricature of them versus us. For the Islamic fundamentalist, there can never be peace, there can never be compromise, there can never be reason, because that is entirely contrary to the worldview. And so I think the very important thing to take from this, from Islamic fundamentalism at its core and its root when it comes to some of the world's world's most well-known and notorious Islamic fundamentalist organizations is that whether or not the United States or the Jews or Israel exist or are in the Middle East and beyond, the violence will never and can never cease. Civilians and children who are infidels, who are gentiles, and who are Islamic will be unalived and necessarily have to be unalived. This is an essential underlying point of Islamic fundamentalism.
So I just read A Letter to America, and I will never look at life the same. I will never look at this country the same. Please read it, and if you have read it, let me know if you are also going through an existential crisis in this very moment, because in the last 20 minutes, my entire viewpoint on the entire life I have believed and I have lived has changed.
A thing that I find really interesting about these TikToks is this idea of an existential crisis that all of these people are going through. They're going through some kind of moment of awakening or enlightenment. They are seeing the world differently after reading bin Laden's letter to America. Now, as I've explained when it comes to Islamic fundamentalism, I think it is very important not to take what Osama bin Laden, an Islamic fundamentalist, is saying about US or Western-led foreign policy, because he is inevitably saying this, or was inevitably saying this, from a very, very biased perspective, and not just biased insofar as, at least these TikTokers believe, he was acting out of reaction to US foreign policy, but from the perspective of his ideals and ideology. Ideals and ideology which he came to believe wholeheartedly by the age of 17. I think Osama bin Laden was very successful, as well as Al-Qaeda has been very successful in creating this fantastical image of Osama bin Laden as some kind of poor revolutionary, as some kind of struggler, hiding out from US Navy SEALs trying to murder him before he released all their secrets. In fact, Osama bin Laden was the son of Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, the founder of the Saudi bin Laden Group, a multinational construction conglomerate. The notorious, absolutely stinking rich bin Laden family are infamously connected to the Saudi royal family and have always been. This is a picture of young Osama bin Laden with his incredibly westernized family on a trip to Sweden in about 1971. I believe the whole family were in Sweden because one of the bin Ladens was negotiating a deal with Volvo. And as I said, by the age of 17, some biographies into the bin Laden family say that by the age of 16, Osama bin Laden had pretty much abandoned his westernization and his Western childhood in favor of what is now known as Islamic fundamentalism. Osama bin Laden's childhood was one of wealth, one of privilege, one of opportunity that any child, not just back in the 70s, but any child today can only dream of. It isn't because of any brutality which this incredibly wealthy child experienced, endured, or saw that led to his religious awakening. The consensus tends to be that he was a bored rich kid looking for identity, and he found that in the quote-unquote degeneracy of the West that he observed. That is, the degeneracy of the West that he observed whilst he summer schooled and summered in Oxford, went on vacation throughout Europe, and spent time with his two Spanish female friends. Osama bin Laden wasn't radicalized by the actions of the West. He was radicalized by his own personal identity crisis that eventually the entire world would have to become a part of and endure and suffer the consequences of. Contrary to the public image of him hiding out in the mountains, being pursued by US Navy SEALs before being shot, Osama bin Laden was actually living in a $1 million palatial mansion and and compound in Pakistan's Abbottabad. He lived there in his mansion that was specifically built for him in 2005 for a total of 6 years. He wasn't living like some rogue revolutionary or struggler all by himself alone, fearing for his safety and life. In fact, he was able to live as a strict and patriarchal father and family man with a fully functioning security system at his disposal, whilst Osama bin Laden was living in a $1 million mansion and compound with full security with his family, his youngest bride. He had, at least according to experts, at least 5 wives or 4 wives, 4 or 5 wives, and with many of his children at this mansion and compound. He was directly or indirectly involved in terrorist attacks, not just against white people or whatever you want to call white people, Britons, Westerners. He was responsible for terrorist attacks against the very people that he claimed to be fighting for. Afghans, Indians, Jordanians, Pakistanis, all of them civilians. This is not the action of a freedom fighter. This is the action of a fundamentalist.
It started as a normal school day, but then the Taliban stormed the building. As the killing began, security forces moved in and fierce gun battles followed. News of the attacks spread, and anguished parents rushed to the scene, not knowing if their children were alive or dead.
And I think this brings up another very important thing, which is, I think, often taken for granted when it comes to Islamic fundamentalists, which is the importance of human shields. And this is something that is very characteristic of terrorist organizations. Think of Boko Haram and the mass kidnapping of Nigerian girls to come and be brides and ultimately act as human shields.
Bring back our girls. Oh, bring back our army.
Think of Hamas headquartering and having tunnels running under civilian areas, under hospitals and essential civilian services. Think of how Osama bin Laden was constantly surrounded by not just his wives, but his children. Think of how Osama bin Laden used his youngest wife as a human shield minutes before he was shot. And I think it's important to note here, when it comes to the shooting of Osama bin Laden, that this idea that the US military, or that even in the case of the current war happening between Israel and Palestine, is indiscriminate bombing of civilians, nothing is planned or coordinated, that it is basically terrorism, is not the full picture, and warfare and international warfare is far more complex than that. In fact, when it came to Osama bin Laden, Barack Obama rejected initial plans to bomb the compound. Instead, he had elite Team 6 special forces enter and raid the compound. Bin Laden, as is characteristic of Islamic fundamentalists, chose to have his family with him, knowing full well that this creates and has created contradictions and creates obvious issues when it comes to nation states having to follow or being under the scrutiny and watchful eye of the laws of armed conflict. When it comes to states, the law of armed conflict is something which they have to abide by. And in this, most importantly, is the tenet that they have to distinguish very clearly and very purposefully between civilians and combatants. And this is why fundamentalist groups the world over refuse to distinguish between civilians and combatants. As I said, I find it so interesting how they're going through an existential crisis, a crisis of identity, I suppose, as Americans or as Westerners. And Osama bin Laden was also going through a crisis when he was young, a crisis of identity and explanation of the world and becoming a man.
I need you to stop what you're doing and go read A Letter to America. It is literally the craziest thing I've read in a while. And while I can't say that I'm that surprised, I am pretty shocked. So go read it and tell me what you think, because I really also need to talk to other people about this. And actually, before you even read the letter, I did want to mention, in reading the letter, I could only think of this tweet that I saw the other day. Under settler colonialism, any kind of resistance is branded as terrorist because the only acceptable violence is violence by the occupier.
I think it is so incredible, and I mean incredible as in incredible, like fascinating, intriguing how religious fundamentalism has been able to essentially co-opt ideas about colonialism, about a colonizer, a very clear idea and caricature of a colonizer. And it's been able to do this to the extent that the most illiberal things are being justified or are being seen as somewhat reasonable or understandable by liberal individuals whom these very fundamentalists would, from the get-go of any creation of the world that they see, have executed publicly. And this is because violence is inherent to fundamentalism. It isn't about colonialism. This isn't about the world. This isn't about foreign policy insofar as just boots on the ground. This is about an ideal of a world, the creation of, for example, with the Islamic State Khorasan or with Boko Haram, this creation of an Islamic state, of a caliphate. Just look at Afghanistan and the Taliban. And even though the Taliban has formed a government, is no longer, at least officially, considered terroristic and has essentially quashed Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan altogether since the US withdrawal from Kabul, the Taliban is still at its core and based just on its founding, based on its roots, an Islamic fundamentalist organization. Violence is endemic to it. I think it is very telling that since the withdrawal of the colonizer, the US, from Afghanistan, violence in Afghanistan, violence perpetuated by the Taliban against Afghan civilians, and has, according to some sources, gotten even worse when it comes to the treatment of Afghanis. And this is excluding the Taliban's treatment of women and girls. And just to further demonstrate how complex this all is, the withdrawal of US troops from Kabul wasn't because the Taliban and Afghanis had chased out the colonizer, because they were liberating themselves from colonial powers and influences over their affairs and land. In fact, US withdrawal from Kabul was on condition that the Taliban, forming a government, would repress Al-Qaeda and Islamic State Khorasan. Since the US withdrawal, the CIA has been sharing intelligence with the Taliban. I think right now it is clear that the interests of the Taliban and the US align. I guess if we're going to use the terms of pop academia, this would mean that the interests of the colonized and the colonizer align, of the imperialized and the imperialist align. Who would have thunk that the world is actually far more complex than what it is regrettably given credit for? And this is characteristic of international relations, because right now the interests of the US and the Taliban align, but this is clearly and obviously at a price and a cost. This represents a contradiction of liberal values and liberalism that essentially the US and the West have actually abandoned young girls, women and children to the fate of an Islamic fundamentalist government, and thus to the inevitable violence that the Taliban represents and will continue to inevitably represent because of everything that I have detailed in this video. And this demonstrates that there is just always contradictions. There are always compromises that are made in international relations, that it is very difficult to abide by anything resembling a just war theory, that it is nigh impossible to really interpret, to adequately align oneself to, as a nation, to the laws of armed conflict. And like I said, nothing is clear-cut. There is no clear-cut dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots, between the colonized and the colonizer, between good and bad. In the 1970s, the CIA worked with the intelligence chief of the Palestinian Liberation Organization for almost an entire decade. And this was even though Israel had classified him as a terrorist. I say this just to express that all of these things are not so clear clear-cut or in the realm of our full understanding and appreciation. The world of foreign policy and international relations cannot be reduced to buzzwords or to pamphlets or to sympathizing with the explanations put forward by a clearly biased religious zealot and fundamentalist who has the blood of hundreds of thousands of women and children and innocent men on his hands. Everybody is entitled and everybody inevitably goes through moments of awakening, through identity crises. But in that, we should be cautious of perceiving ourselves as knowing more than we actually do. We should caution ourselves against perceiving ourselves to be informed when we are all so clearly and so mortifyingly ill-informed. There are a lot of decisions which individuals whom I do not care a hoot about, whom I absolutely loathe insofar as what they represent, have to make. And they have to make decisions that I personally wouldn't make. But I would say that I wouldn't make those decisions because I don't have the information which they have, because I don't have the expectations, the burdens, the pressure which they have. A pressure, burden, and expectation that is represented by every single one of these TikToks, that of keeping civilians safe, that of upholding a stable nation state so that civilians can be delusional, privileged, entitled, ill-informed liberals and not suffer the true consequences of that, so that these predominantly women can exist in a society where they are not fearing being repressed or having their rights taken away by their government on a day-to-day basis, so that these women in these TikToks can, like me, get their nails done beautifully, something which Afghani women and children are forbidden from doing, so that these individual TikTokers can express their views openly on a platform without repercussions, without fear of the loss of their lives or their families' lives, so that we can worry about our identities, we can worry about the things that we worry about and care about. I think it is very important that we don't take this for granted. And I think it's interesting when we think about self-determination. I think a good example of this is countries that want Sharia law as the law of the land. I think the most comprehensive survey of this was done in 2013. And when you look at the countries who want, or where the majority of Muslims want Sharia law, it is Afghanistan, Iraq, the Palestinian territories, Malaysia, Niger, Pakistan, Morocco, Bangladesh, Djibouti. And isn't it interesting how these are the countries where women are the most repressed, where they have the least autonomy, bodily autonomy, political and social autonomy, and ability to exercise their rights as women, their humanhood, have the least access to education. And I think this demonstrates a contradiction and a double-edged sword, not just in this idea of self-determination and that of self-determination of a colonized, I guess, quote unquote, not my quote, people, but the contradictions in just everything. Because I can't help but wonder if these statistics would be different, especially when we consider that in Afghanistan, where 99% of people want Sharia law, the literacy rate of men is a mere 52% and of women a mere 23%. So I just say all of these things to really just say that Osama bin Laden's letter to America, or letter to the American people, is really not that profound. It overly simplifies something that should never be simplified or reduced to a caricaturing of ideas of people. It is a letter that is inherently anti-Semitic, that is inherently anti-Palestinian people, that is civilians, that is inherently anti-civilians, anti-women and children, that is anti-anybody who does not want to conform to Sharia law. If you are not an Islamic fundamentalist, according to the standards and expectations of Al-Qaeda, then you are not worthy of being a part of this world. It is just quite eerie to think that somebody like Osama bin Laden criticizing US foreign policy can drive such a response. And I think it is quite frightening and is quite telling of where Western liberal ideals are currently. How I would say a lot of young people are very disenchanted with what is being offered in the West. And I don't think that this exclusively comes from a place of privilege. I think that this comes from a place also of abandonment by our modern political system, where Westerners are increasingly not seeing much hope in the future of their country, are not connected to their communities and to people, where identity politics is the rule of the day, where identity tribes dominate and isolate us from each other, from varying perspectives, from understanding and from empathy. I think these are merely people on TikTok who believe themselves to be far more informed and politically aware than they actually are. This is one of the reasons why I'm very cautious to call myself political, because I'm very aware of how ill-informed I am about the world and about politics, that I am very much informed by my feelings and emotions when it comes to watching the news, seeing what is happening in the world, and that this is something that is far more complex than I could ever possibly comprehend, than any of us could ever really properly comprehend and understand. So yes, it is very peculiar to see young, brown, predominantly brown Western woman simping over Osama bin Laden's letter, or even over Osama bin Laden himself. But this is the world that we live in, and I think it's important for us to discuss this, for us to try and understand this, as opposed to just pointing the finger at the other side and deeming them to just be crazy, stupid people. Of course, very stupid things have been said, but people have various reasons for saying the very stupid things that they say, and I'm more interested in the reasons behind why they say the stupid things that they say. So do let me know in the comment section what you think about this. I would be very interested to have a conversation about this. I think we can and we necessarily have to do so much better in order to realize the world that we all seemingly want, which is a world where people see us, where people understand us, where people humanize us. And I am very sorry to say, but Osama bin Laden's letter to America is not the place where you want to have an awakening, an epiphany, or a realization about anything, aside from how absolutely devastating existential warfare and perennial warfare under Islamic fundamentalist principles will be, not just to the world, but to the very people, the very Muslims who it claims to represent and have the best interests at hand for. Thank you so much for watching. My camera and lighting is about to die. I have been recording for about 3 hours. So yes, as I said, let me know what you think. And thank you so much for watching this video. And I will see all of you very soon in the next one.